We had a phenomenal day today. Negro League Museum.
That was Glen Kuiper, the former color commentator of the soon-to-be former Oakland Athletics. Prior to the game they were covering, Kuiper and his co-commentator visited the Negro League Museum, a museum celebrating the Negro Leagues and its many great players. The reason for the Negro League's existence, of course, was racial segregation in Major League Baseball up until the time of Negro League great Jackie Robinson. As you just saw, Glen made what may be the single biggest speech error in American culture today. Today, he was fired. In this video, I'm going to talk about why I am tentatively, strongly against the firing. But before I do, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Ron. I am a biracial Canadian immigrant to America. My father was a white, multi-generation Canadian of Western European descent, and my mother was a refugee immigrant to Canada from Uganda. She and her family were exiled from the country under threat of death by Idi Amin in 1971. My mother is of Indian and Middle Eastern descent. I am strongly against racism. My values align most closely with old-school liberalism, though I have come to appreciate the wisdom that is often contained in more traditional practices, though they also have their burdens. So I'm open-minded. But at the end of the day, I believe that you should be you. I am extensively educated in psychology. I graduated with high distinction from the University of Toronto, where I studied psychology research and cognitive science. I then went on to study cognitive psychology and cognitive science at Rutgers University, where I was in the master's and PhD program. But I left the program due to the poor career prospects of aspiring professors. I've continued to be an avid, independent student of psychology, however, and regularly make videos on subjects of interest to me in the field. Lastly, while I have been a fan of baseball all my life, one thing that I am decidedly not a fan of is living in a culture that is so quick to assume the worst of someone and to call for their exile from polite society. When I posted my first video about this several weeks ago, I had some people asking me why I was so desperate to protect this guy and to deny his alleged racism. My response to this is that I don't know if he's racist or not, though I have strong doubts about it. He has, after all, worked in the Bay Area in sports media covering a multi-ethnic sport for decades, and this is the first time he has garnered negative public attention. But, do I know for sure? No. However, I also don't know for sure that you, the viewer, are not racist. And I don't think that this video that, that we just watched gives us any more reason to believe that he's a racist than that you are. In this video, I am going to go into the cognitive science of why I don't take this unfortunate incident as being any sort of a mask-off moment on Glen's part. So to those who, after watching this video, would still ask, why am I so determined to protect Glen or to deny racism, I would ask, why are you so determined to bury Glen and insist upon racism to the point where you may actually be engaging in scientific denialism? I will also state that the research that I'm going to be discussing is the foundation for the Implicit Association Test, which has been cited by many progressives as scientific proof of widespread implicit bigotry. As such, if you're going to dismiss the case I make here, and you're going to be consistent, you will need to dismiss the IAT. So let's get into my case in defense of Glen. My case hinges primarily on the extensive psychological research into psychological or cognitive priming. Psychological priming refers to when the phenomenon wherein when you encounter one thing, it can affect how you process the next thing that is presented to you if it is presented to you very quickly after the first one. Primes can be positive or negative, that is, they can aid or impede the cognitive processing of the subsequent thing. Priming studies often involve a person being presented with a prime and then having to make a decision about something they see immediately after, such as, for example, is the thing they see after a word or not a word, or is it good or is it bad? And their task is to respond as quickly as they can. So as an example of one priming research protocol, participants are presented with a word, and then immediately after, they are presented with a string of letters that may or may not be a word. And their job is to indicate whether the second thing they saw was a word or not as quickly as they can. So here's an example of how it would work. If they were first presented with the word fruit, studies have shown that people tend to respond faster to indicate a word if what they see next is apple or banana as opposed to boat. They call this semantic or conceptual positive priming. Another priming research protocol involves asking people to categorize a word that they see as being either good or bad. But before they see that word, unbeknownst to the participant, they are subliminally presented with a word that is either congruent or incongruent with the emotional valence of the target word. So for example, if the priming word is death, so maybe they were shown that on the screen, on the computer screen for a third, a really small amount of time that they can't consciously, they're not aware that they saw it, but at an unconscious level, it was perceived. If they see a word like death, they will be quicker to identify a word like hate as being bad than they would be at identifying smile as being good. In fact, in the case of smile, they will actually categorize it more slowly after being subliminally presented with an emotionally incongruent word than if they had not been primed at all, or if they had been primed with a more neutral word like car or boat. So these are examples of positive and negative affective priming. There are all sorts of priming, some of which I will discuss with respect to the Kuiper situation. Psychologists tend to understand priming effects as demonstrations of how our brains are wired. When you observe a priming effect, it is speculated that this occurs because the activation of one thing in the brain, for example, a concept or a sound pattern, when that is activated, you will see partial activation for other things that are related to the first thing. So for example, related concepts or other similar sound patterns. Research into psychological priming dates back to the 1950s. Now, I will say that we may need to consider at least some of the research into priming with skepticism. As some viewers will know, in 2011, social psychology came under fire in what was called the replication crisis. Putting it briefly, a lot of important studies in social psychology, as well as some other fields, were found not to be reproducible when people other than the original researchers attempted to do the studies. So this called the credibility of research in social psychology into question. And indeed, at least some studies in the area of priming have failed to replicate. Now, my personal suspicion is that at least some types of cognitive priming are real, but it'll be up to cognitive and social psychologists to sort that all out. So with that important caveat aside, I'm going to discuss a series of types of cognitive priming that pertain to the Glen Kuiper situation: semantic, affective, phonological, and syllabic priming. I have included relevant links on each of these types of priming in the video description below if you want to check them out. So let's recall, Glen said the N-word when intending to say Negro League Museum. I don't believe that many people think he said what he said deliberately. Rather, the common theory of Glen's detractors is that he made something of a Freudian slip. The fact that he accidentally said this word, they believe, is evidence that he is so used to saying it that it came out accidentally. The logic is that if it was a word that he didn't use, it would not have popped into his head in this situation. We are all armchair psychologists, and this is a perfectly understandable case of armchair psychologizing. And I don't mean that in any sort of a dismissive or derogatory way. Academic psychologists have made a cottage industry of showing how often we are all wrong in our attempts at understanding others, and even in our attempts to understand ourselves. And findings in this very area of cognitive priming have been surprising psychology students for decades. So there's no shame in having that kind of inclination. It does make a certain amount of commonsensical type sense. As discussed above, there are all sorts of cognitive priming. For decades, research into priming, say semantic or phonological, have allegedly found measurable priming effects when the priming occurs along just one dimension. So for example, people will respond faster to say that anger is a word if they had just saw the word feeling, would be a case of semantic priming, or if they had just seen the word Angola, which would be phonological priming, or if they just saw the word angle, which would be phonological and syllabic priming, or if they just saw the word bad, which would be affective priming. In Glen's case, he had all 4 of these types of priming working at the same time, one on top of the other. In terms of semantics, the N-word and Negro both refer to the same group of people. They have the same referent. In terms of affective priming or emotional priming, both have a negative valence. Now, obviously, the N-word, the magnitude of the negative valence is much, much higher, whereas Negro is sort of like Oriental, a term that many people find jarring to hear, especially in highly educated, racially sensitive places like the Bay Area. And if you were to say it, it will often induce a somewhat embarrassing correction. So the words have different degrees of negativity associated with them, but they are both in the negative direction. So there's your affective priming. That's 2. Phonologically, the 2 words have the same first letter and sound. So just as bull primes beer, these words can be expected to prime each other. But it goes even further than that. The 2 words have all the same consonant sounds in the same sequence, and they have the same number of syllables. So now we also have syllabic priming. That's 4 types of priming. Now, if you trust the psychological research into priming and you want to be intellectually honest, you have to admit that this is a cognitive priming slam dunk. Now, some may say, well, he should have been more careful. But being careful would entail him actively having the N-word in mind. You can't be careful about something that you are not thinking of. And would you have preferred that he had the N-word on his mind? Would that have been better? Moreover, as I talked about in my first video on this subject, psychologists have found that attempts to suppress an idea from one's mind actually serves to keep it in mind more than if the person were not trying to suppress it. After all, how can you keep the N-word out of your thoughts if you don't have it in your thoughts so that you know what not to think about? If it never occurs to you not to think of a pink elephant, you almost definitely will not think of one. But the second you start trying not to, you guarantee that it will continually pop into your mind. These are the academic psychological reasons that I don't believe that we should read anything into Glen's speech error. But the argument doesn't stop there. After this unfortunate incident, the president of the Negro League Museum, Bob Kendrick, a black man, stated that Glen was excited to be at the museum, and Glen portrayed this excitement in the clip in question. Bob also said that he doesn't know what's in Glen's heart, but that he hopes that people can forgive him. Glen has also received public support from Oakland A's great Dave Stewart, who is also a black man. Stewart stated that he knows and has worked with Glen over the years, that he believes this was a mistake, and that he believes Glen deserves a second chance. At the beginning of this video, I said that I was tentatively against Glen's firing. The reason for my tentativeness is that it has been said that the firing was based in part on other information uncovered during the investigation into this matter. If we find out that Glen has engaged in racist activities, then my mind will change based on the evidence of these other activities. But I do not believe that this speech error is standalone evidence of anything. Thanks for your time.